The unnoticed Wolf Willow ran a hand over the well-worn grey fabric of her travel cloak, a material so muted it seemed to drink the light. Her satchel lay open on the cot, a neat inventory of her sparse belongings. 2 tunics, a pair of rugged breeches, and a single undyed linen dress, reserved for the mating gathering. She'd also packed a small cache of dried berries, a wedge of cheese, and her grandfather's compass, its brass casing dulled by generations of touch. Nothing ostentatious, nothing to attract attention, much like herself. She idly traced the faded lunar cycle embroidered on the cloak's hem, a skill her grandmother had taught her. The threads blended almost seamlessly with the grey, a subtle testament to her quiet existence. She moved through life like a peripheral wolf, observing from the edges, rarely engaging. Her packmates often overlooked her until they needed an impartial ear or a meticulous task completed without fanfare. The anonymity no longer stung. Instead, it offered a peculiar freedom, a peaceful invisibility that allowed her to absorb the world without being consumed by it. The mating gathering, however, threatened this carefully cultivated peace. It promised a riot of scents, a whirlwind of hormonal energy and ambition, a grand spectacle intended to forge powerful alliances. Willow's only desire was to melt into the background, a mere shadow among the throngs, and emerge 3 days later, blessedly unchosen. She sought no mate, only continued obscurity. With a soft sigh, she cinched the satchel closed, the simple leather strap cool against her palm. It felt light, unburdened by extravagant desires or the weight of expectation. She relished the uncomplicated rhythm of her life. The trek to the transport hub blurred past, a familiar winding of forest paths, punctuated by the faint, growing murmur of distant voices. As she neared the clearing, the air grew thick with pine and an overpowering medley of wolf musk, excitement, anxiety, raw anticipation. Her heightened senses, usually a comfort, now felt like a curse. She pulled her cloak tighter, hunching her shoulders instinctively. A small grey field mouse venturing into a lion's den. The hub itself was a sprawling, chaotic panorama. Caravans, wagons, and carriages of every conceivable size and design lined up, some already filled, others bustling with porters and boisterous passengers. Wolves milled everywhere, their collective voices a continuous roar, their energy a palpable force. There were the swaggering young males, preening and jostling, and the elegant females, their fur gleaming, their scents artfully modulated for maximum allure. Willow felt like a rough sketch amidst vibrant oil paintings. She clutched her satchel, her gaze flitting between the various conveyances. Her ticket, a flimsy parchment indicating a shared public carriage, felt insubstantial in her hand. She needed to locate her designated loading area, but the sheer volume of bodies and vehicles made it impossible to discern anything. A group of heavily perfumed she-wolves giggled past, their laughter echoing, making her feel even smaller. The air grew stifling, laden with dust and the cloying sweetness of artificial scents. A throbbing began behind Willow's eyes. She desperately needed a moment of quiet, a sliver of respite before confronting the inevitable crush of public transport. Her eyes scanned the periphery, searching for any haven. Then she saw it. Tucked away on a secluded spur of track, almost entirely obscured by a colossal oak, sat a carriage unlike any other. It was a masterpiece of polished dark wood and gleaming brass, its windows tinted a deep, opaque black. The wheels were massive, intricately carved with patterns that hinted at something ancient, almost menacing. No crests, no banners, no identifying marks adorned it, yet its sheer grandeur spoke volumes of immense power and wealth. Crucially, it appeared utterly deserted. No wolves milled around it, no porters loaded luggage. It stood in silent, imposing shadow amidst the chaos. A wave of desperate longing for solitude washed over her. It had to be a private carriage, perhaps awaiting a delayed arrival, but for now, it was an oasis. She could just slip inside, find a quiet corner, and gather herself before rejoining the fray. No one would notice. No one ever did. With a furtive glance around, Willow moved towards it, her steps light and quick. She reached the carriage door, a heavy slab of dark wood, and found it unlatched. With a soft click, it swung inward, revealing a surprising interior. Plush, velvet seating, richer than anything she'd ever touched, lined the walls. Soft, muted light filtered through the tinted windows, bathing the space in a tranquil glow. It smelled faintly of old leather and something else, something cold and sharp, like the very breath of winter. It was empty, gloriously, beautifully empty. Willow slipped inside, her worn boots sinking into the thick pile of the carpet. She closed the door softly behind her, the latch clicking shut with a satisfying thud. The sudden silence was a balm to her overstimulated senses. She took a deep breath, letting the tension seep from her shoulders. This was perfect, just a few moments of peace before facing the world again. She settled onto one of the velvet benches, pulling her satchel onto her lap. The material felt impossibly soft beneath her fingers. She closed her eyes, allowing the quiet to envelop her. The faint rumble of the hub was now a distant hum, barely perceptible. A sudden, sharp jolt threw her forward. Her eyes snapped open. The carriage lurched again, a deep rumble vibrating through the floor. The landscape outside the tinted window began to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed. The grand oak tree receded, then the bustling hub itself. Panic flared in her chest, cold and sharp. The door. She rushed to it, fumbling with the heavy brass handle. It was locked. She rattled it, pushed, pulled, but it remained stubbornly shut. The carriage was moving faster now, the rhythmic clatter of its wheels against the tracks growing louder, carrying her away from the only world she knew. She was trapped. Trapped in a carriage she didn't belong in, heading somewhere she hadn't intended, and utterly alone. Or was she? A shiver ran down her spine, a prickling sensation that whispered of unseen eyes. The scent of cold, sharp winter air seemed to intensify. It wasn't just old leather. It was something else, something primal, something dangerous. Willow sank back onto the velvet bench, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The journey had begun, and she, the unnoticed wolf, was now irrevocably part of it. The mating gathering suddenly felt like a distant, minor worry. Her anonymity had just been violently snatched away. A royal encounter. Willow's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped within a cage. The carriage's rhythmic sway, once a soothing lull, now felt like the deliberate rocking of a predator about to pounce. A shiver traced its way down her spine, not from the chill of the evening, but from the unsettling silence of the opulent space. She clutched the plush fabric of the seat, her knuckles white, her gaze darting to every shadowed corner, convinced she was alone, yet an instinct screamed otherwise. Then, a low rumble vibrated through the carriage, a sound so deep it seemed to emanate from the very floorboards. It was a voice, resonant and commanding, that pierced the suffocating quiet. "Are you quite finished with your clandestine inspection, little wolf?" Willow gasped, her breath catching in her throat. She spun around, her fur bristling, emerging from the deeper shadows at the far end of the carriage, near what looked like a heavy oak desk, was a figure that stole the air from her lungs. Tall, broad-shouldered, and radiating an aura of chilling authority, he moved with the effortless grace of a seasoned hunter. His fur, a rich, dark obsidian, seemed to absorb the dim light, making him appear even more imposing. His eyes, when they finally locked onto hers, were the colour of molten gold, sharp and unyielding, like a hawk spotting its prey from miles above. They bore into her, dissecting her, leaving no part of her feeling untouched or unseen. It was the Alpha King Thorn. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, stealing what little breath she had left. Thorn, the most powerful wolf in the kingdom, the one whose reputation for ruthlessness preceded him like a winter storm, was staring directly at her. "What is your purpose aboard this carriage, little one?" Thorn's voice was devoid of warmth, each word a chip of ice. He took a slow, deliberate step towards her, and then another, the subtle shift in his weight echoing the predatory stillness of a wolf preparing to strike. The air crackled with a tension so thick Willow could almost taste it, metallic and sharp. "Speak, before my patience wears thin." Willow's tongue felt like sandpaper against the roof of her mouth. Her mind, usually a whirlwind of anxious thoughts, was now utterly blank, a slate wiped clean by terror. She tried to form words, but only a pathetic squeak escaped. Her ears, usually laid back in submission, were now pressed flat against her skull. This was worse than any nightmare she could conjure. Being chosen at the mating gathering was one thing. Being discovered as an unwitting trespasser in the Alpha King's private transport was an entirely different, far more perilous predicament. Thorn stopped a few feet from her, his golden eyes narrowed, examining her with an intensity that made her entire being tremble. He was a force of nature, a living legend, and she was just Willow. Anonymous, forgettable Willow. Or at least, she was supposed to be. "Your name," Thorn prompted, his voice a low growl that vibrated through the floor. "And your pack. Now." Willow," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze, if only for a fleeting second. "Just Willow. I don't belong to a pack, Alpha King." The admission hung in the air, a silent testament to her solitary existence, and perhaps, in his eyes, further proof of her suspicious nature. Thorn's golden eyes flickered, a momentary spark of something unreadable. "An unbonded wolf," he mused, the words laced with a dangerous edge. "How intriguing! Now, explain to me, Willow, how an unbonded wolf comes to be occupying my private carriage, uninvited and clearly unwelcome." The accusation in his tone was unmistakable. Willow's cheeks flushed with a heat that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with fear. I made a mistake, Alpha King," she blurted out, the words tumbling over each other in a desperate rush. "I was at the transport hub for the gathering, and it was so chaotic. I just wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere away from all the noise and this carriage. It seemed empty. I truly didn't know it was yours. I would never presume." Her voice trailed off, her explanation sounding flimsy even to her own ears. How could she possibly convince him that she, a reclusive, utterly insignificant wolf, had simply stumbled into his domain? The absurdity of it was almost laughable, if not for the very real and terrifying consequences staring her in the face. She braced herself, waiting for the inevitable punishment, for the fury that she knew a wolf of his standing would undoubtedly unleash. Her anonymity, her quiet life, her very existence, all were now laid bare before the cold, discerning eyes of the Alpha King. 3 days trapped, the carriage jolted, a sudden lurch that threw Willow momentarily off balance, sending a fresh wave of panic through her. Thorn remained unmoving, a statue carved from ice and iron, his gaze pinning her. The air crackled with a dangerous stillness, broken only by the rhythmic thud of hooves on the unseen road. "You haven't answered me." Thorn's voice was a low growl, devoid of patience. "Why are you in my carriage?" Willow swallowed hard, her throat raw. I made a mistake, Alpha King. I swear. I wasn't trying to intrude. Her voice was a reedy whisper, barely audible over the increasing speed of the carriage. She gestured helplessly towards the window, the world outside a blur of greens and browns. The mating gathering, it was chaos. I was just trying to find a ride, a way to get there. It was so crowded, so many carriages. She trailed off, realizing how ludicrous it sounded. Thorn's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them. "A ride," he repeated, the words dripping with disbelief. "You mistook the Alpha King's private carriage for common transport." Willow flinched. "I didn't know it was yours. I truly didn't. There was no insignia, no guards I could see, just an open door, and I was so desperate to get away from the crowds." She wrung her hands, her gaze darting from his formidable face to the plush velvet interior, every detail now feeling overwhelmingly opulent and, by extension, accusing. Thorn sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of an ancient forest. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a rare, almost human gesture that momentarily softened the harsh lines of his face. "Regardless of your unfortunate navigational skills," he began, his voice taking on a grim, resigned tone, "we are already well underway. The closest outpost is half a day's journey behind us." A cold dread began to seep into Willow's bones, chilling her more effectively than any winter wind. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. "Half a day? But the mating gathering?" Thorn's gaze hardened again, losing its fleeting softness. "Is 3 days from now, by this route. 3 days at this pace without stopping for anything or anyone." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. 3 days. Trapped. With the Alpha King. Willow felt her stomach lurch, a wave of nausea washing over her. She couldn't breathe. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a disaster. An unbonded she-wolf, discovered trespassing in the Alpha King's private transport, journeying with him for 3 days. The implications were catastrophic. Her reputation, already fragile, would be utterly destroyed. She would be branded, at best, a fool, at worst, an opportunist, a schemer. "You cannot stop," she managed, the words a desperate plea. Thorn shook his head, a muscle ticking in his jaw. "I cannot. This journey is timed precisely. Any deviation, any delay, could have repercussions for the entire kingdom." His gaze flickered to her, a hint of something that might have been regret, or perhaps just irritation in their depths. "You will have to remain." The finality of his tone was a physical blow. Willow felt her legs give out from under her, and she sank to the floor of the carriage, huddling against the furthest wall, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. The soft carpet did little to cushion the impact of her despair. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of panicked thoughts. What would people say? What would he say? Thorn, the formidable, unapproachable Alpha King, now saddled with an unwanted, unbonded companion for the better part of a week. She risked a glance at him. He had turned his head, staring out the window, his profile etched against the passing landscape, a study in rigid control. He seemed utterly unconcerned with her plight, focused only on the unseen horizon and the pressing duties that awaited him. He was a force of nature, and she was merely a leaf caught in his powerful current, swept along to an unknown, terrifying destination. A wave of utter desolation washed over Willow. 3 days. 3 days of this unbearable tension, this crushing proximity to power, this constant fear of further missteps. The mating gathering, the event she had both dreaded and yearned for, now seemed a distant, impossible dream, replaced by this suffocating reality. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the opulent carriage, the scent of expensive leather, the looming presence of the Alpha King. But the rhythmic thud of the hooves, carrying her further and further from everything she knew, was a relentless reminder. She was trapped, utterly and irrevocably trapped. Silence and scrolls, the rhythmic clatter of hooves on the ancient road, became the only soundtrack to Willow's deepening despair. Every jolt of the carriage was a fresh reminder of her predicament, a physical manifestation of the impossible distance growing between her and the mating gathering. Thorn, a mountain of silent authority, had returned to his seat opposite her, a heavy silence descending that felt thicker than the carriage walls. It pressed in, stifling any breath she might have attempted to take, any question she might have dared to voice. Willow focused intently on the intricate patterns stitched into the velvet upholstery of her corner, as if by memorizing each thread she could somehow weave herself out of existence. Her paws, still trembling slightly, were tucked beneath her, and her tail, usually a lively indicator of her mood, lay limp and lifeless beside her. She imagined herself shrinking, becoming small enough to slip through the cracks in the floorboards, anything to escape the unbearable proximity of the Alpha King. His scent, a potent blend of pine and something ancient, primal, filled the enclosed space, a constant low thrum of power that vibrated against her very bones. It was the scent of command, of unwavering strength, and it amplified her own sense of utter insignificance. She risked a quick, furtive glance. Thorn was not looking at her. His gaze, sharp and unyielding, was fixed on the rolled scrolls spread across the small, polished table between them. His large, scarred fingers, surprisingly agile for their size, unrolled another parchment, revealing lines of precise script and intricate diagrams. He wasn't simply reading, he was dissecting, his brow furrowed in concentration. The angle of his jaw, the slight tension in his shoulders, spoke of weighty matters, of decisions that impacted more than just himself. Willow felt a fresh wave of mortification. Here she was, an accidental stowaway, a frivolous distraction, while the Alpha King navigated the complexities of his kingdom. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light outside the window and the occasional distant bleat of sheep or the call of a bird. The carriage continued its relentless pace, a relentless march away from everything Willow had planned. The hunger gnawing at her stomach was a dull ache, but the knot of fear in her chest was a sharp, persistent pain. She imagined her parents, frantic, searching for her at the gathering grounds, their quiet hope for her future turning to agonizing worry. The thought was a fresh stab, making her squeeze her eyes shut for a moment. When she opened them, Thorn was looking at her. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, held no judgment, no anger, only a deep, unreadable assessment. It was a gaze that saw through pretense, a gaze that seemed to weigh her very being. Willow felt herself flush, her ears burning. She instinctively pulled her shoulders in, making herself even smaller. The silence stretched, taut and fragile between them. She expected him to speak, to perhaps reiterate the impossibility of turning back, to acknowledge her presence in some way. But he didn't. His gaze lingered for a beat longer, then returned to his scrolls. The quiet understanding, or perhaps just resignation, in his eyes was almost more unnerving than a direct reprimand would have been. It implied a certain acceptance of her unfortunate presence, a grim acknowledgement that she was now a variable, however minor, in his meticulously planned journey. She watched him, mesmerized despite herself, as he unrolled another scroll. This one was larger, covered in what looked like geographical markings and strategic points. He traced a line with his finger, his expression unreadable. He was a creature of purpose, every movement deliberate, every thought seemingly dedicated to the vast responsibilities he carried. The air in the carriage grew heavy with the scent of old parchment and Thorn's formidable presence. Willow's initial panic had begun to morph into a dull ache of trapped resignation. The weight of 3 days, stretching out before her like an endless road, settled deep in her bones. She was trapped, undeniably, hopelessly trapped with the Alpha King. The world outside, fleeting glimpses of sun-dappled forests and rolling hills, seemed impossibly far away. A beautiful, free reality she could no longer touch. She was a bird caught in a gilded cage, and the bars were made of the Alpha King's unyielding schedule. The light outside began to dim, casting long shadows within the carriage. Thorn, seemingly oblivious to the passing hours, remained absorbed in his work. He occasionally made a small, almost imperceptible note on a blank portion of a scroll with a finely carved quill, his movements precise and economical. Willow, desperate for distraction, found herself studying the intricate silver clasp on one of the scrolls, then the rich texture of Thorn's dark fur, the broad span of his shoulders. She felt like an uninvited shadow, a whisper in a room built for thunder. And the thunder she knew was the Alpha King. A small gesture. The rhythmic sway of the carriage had long since ceased to be a comfort, transforming instead into a relentless reminder of her confinement. Willow had retreated as far as she could into the corner, a small, forgotten shadow in the opulent space. The afternoon light, filtered through the thick, embroidered curtains, cast the interior in a muted glow, doing little to dispel the gloom that clung to her. Thorn, on the other hand, remained a solid, unmoving presence across from her, his attention still riveted on the scroll spread across the small, inlaid table. The scratching of his quill was the only sound for what felt like an eternity, a steady, indifferent counterpoint to the frantic beating of Willow's heart. Just as the silence began to press in, a soft knock resonated from the carriage door. Thorn grunted, a low, indistinct sound that Willow instinctively interpreted as permission. The door creaked open, revealing Rorik, his eager face flushed from the brisk autumn air. He bowed so deeply his head nearly brushed his knees, a tray laden with steaming dishes held carefully in his trembling hands. "Your Majesty," Rorik stammered, his voice a little higher than usual. "Dinner, freshly prepared, as ordered." He placed the tray on the small table between Thorn and Willow, the clatter of silver against porcelain momentarily shattering the quiet. The aroma of roasted meat, savoury herbs, and something sweet and fruity wafted through the carriage, a cruel reminder of Willow's hunger. She hadn't eaten since that meagre breakfast at the inn, hours before her disastrous stowaway attempt. Her stomach rumbled, a mortifying sound that she hoped was swallowed by the carriage's gentle creaks. Rorik, oblivious to Willow's internal turmoil, began to meticulously arrange Thorn's meal. A large, perfectly roasted pheasant, its skin glistening, took pride of place. Beside it, a mound of fluffy wild rice, studded with dried cranberries and toasted nuts, and a bowl of vibrant green vegetables, steamed to perfection. He poured a dark, rich liquid from a small carafe into a crystal goblet. Every movement was precise, yet underscored by a nervous energy. He glanced at Willow then, a quick, almost apologetic flicker of his gaze, before returning his full attention to the Alpha King. Thorn, however, hadn't even looked up from his scrolls. His large hands, scarred and powerful, continued to turn the parchment, his brow furrowed in concentration. Rorik cleared his throat, a tiny, hopeful sound. "Everything is to your liking, Your Majesty," he ventured, his voice barely a whisper. Thorn finally lifted his head, his deep-set eyes meeting Rorik's. The Alpha's gaze held no anger, but it was enough to make Rorik flinch. "Adequate," Thorn rumbled, a non-committal assessment that seemed to both satisfy and deflate the young guard. Rorik bowed again, a little less deeply this time, and backed out of the carriage with surprising speed, pulling the door shut behind him. The silence returned, though now it was punctuated by the faint clinking of Thorn's cutlery. Willow watched, mesmerized and horrified, as he began to eat. Each bite was deliberate, unhurried, as if he was savoring not just the food, but the very act of nourishment. The scent of the pheasant was intoxicating, making her mouth water. She pressed herself further into the corner, trying to make herself invisible, to quell the embarrassing hunger pangs that threatened to betray her. Thorn finished a piece of the pheasant, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. Then, without a word, without even a glance in her direction, he picked up a smaller, tender-looking piece of the roasted bird. It was dark meat, glistening with juices. His large fingers, surprisingly delicate, held it out, not directly to her, but towards the empty space between them, a silent offering. Willow froze, her breath caught in her throat. The gesture was so unexpected, so out of character with the imposing, silent figure who had barely acknowledged her existence. Was it a trick? A test? Or simply an oversight, a piece he decided he didn't want? Her eyes darted from the meat to his face. His expression remained unreadable, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the carriage window. There was no pity there, no invitation, just a quiet, unyielding presentation. Her stomach gave a particularly insistent growl. The choice, if it was one, was stark: pride or survival. The aroma of the roasted meat was a powerful persuader. Slowly, tentatively, Willow uncurled herself from her corner. Her movements were stiff, hesitant, as if approaching a wild, unpredictable beast. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against his. The warmth of his skin, the surprising softness of the meat, sent a jolt through her. She snatched the offering, pulling her hand back as if burned. She held the piece of pheasant, warm and fragrant, her mind still reeling. Thorn said nothing, merely returned his attention to his meal, his silence as absolute as before. Willow, her heart hammering, took a small, cautious bite. The flavor exploded on her tongue, rich, savory, utterly delicious. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. She ate slowly, savoring every mouthful, the small gesture a bewildering, unsettling warmth in the cold, frightening reality of her situation. She still didn't understand him, but for a fleeting moment, the chasm between them had narrowed, bridged by a single, unexpected piece of roasted pheasant. First words. The lingering aroma of roasted pheasant, a ghost of a feast, encircled Willow. Her stomach growled, a deep, mortifying rumble she pressed a hand against. Thorn, seemingly oblivious, maintained his steady, measured pace of eating, his attention unwavering from the documents in his left hand. The small, surprisingly tender morsel he'd offered earlier had vanished in an instant, leaving her both grateful and acutely aware of her persistent hunger. The carriage's silence, once a heavy shroud, now pulsed with a different energy, a fragile link forged by a brief, shared moment of sustenance. She studied him, her gaze tracing the sharp line of his jaw, the subtle play of muscle as he chewed. His brow remained deeply furrowed, a permanent line etched above eyes that seemed to absorb all light. He was a king, she reminded herself, a being of immense power. She, merely a forest creature snared in a gilded cage, yet that small kindness, the unexpected offering, had chipped away at her terror. It was a minuscule fracture, but enough to admit a sliver of curiosity. "Your scrolls," she began, her voice a reedy whisper in the cavernous space, rusty and unused. "Are they important?" Thorn paused, his fork half lifted. He didn't immediately look at her, his focus still fixed on the parchment. A taut silence stretched. thin as a thread, threatening to snap. Willow braced herself for a sharp retort, a dismissal, or a renewed wave of icy indifference. Regret tightened around her, her courage already deserting her as a hot flush of embarrassment stained her cheeks. Then, slowly, he lowered his fork. His twilight-coloured eyes finally met hers. A flicker passed through them, a brief spark she couldn't quite decipher. Surprise, perhaps, or a momentary shift from his usual stony composure. He remained silent, merely observing her with an intensity that prickled her skin. They seem to demand a great deal of your attention. She pressed on, emboldened by his lack of immediate rebuke, though her voice still trembled. Are they decrees? Petitions? What does an Alpha King do? The question hung in the air, audacious in its simplicity, perhaps even naive. She expected a dismissive snort, a withering glare. Instead, Thorne's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. It was such a subtle change, she might have imagined it, a trick of the carriage's flickering lantern light. They are the burdens of a kingdom, he finally said. His voice a low rumble, richer and deeper than she remembered from their tense encounters. He gestured vaguely with the hand holding the scrolls, still not offering a closer look. Reports from border patrols, land disputes, trade agreements, judicial appeals, matters of resource allocation, infrastructure, defense. He listed them in a monotone, a litany of responsibilities that sounded both vast and exhausting, and the occasional appeal from a distant pack for assistance, or a complaint regarding unruly subjects. His eyes held hers, a surprising depth to their usual coldness. It is a constant tide, Willow, one that never recedes. The candour in his voice, the almost weary honesty, was astonishing. It was more than she had dared hope for, more than she had any right to expect. She had braced herself for a curt, uninformative answer, a stark reminder of their differing stations. Instead, he had offered her a glimpse, however brief, into the sheer weight of his world. A flicker of something, not warmth, not exactly, but a fleeting hint of the man beneath the monarch, crossed his face then. It was a momentary loosening of the rigid mask he wore, a hint of the immense pressure he carried. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual stoic expression, but Willow had seen it. It was a minute crack in the formidable facade, a fleeting vulnerability that belied the image of the unyielding Alpha King. He picked up his fork again, resuming his meal, but the atmosphere in the carriage had undeniably shifted. The air, once thick with unspoken tension, now held a faint echo of connection, a subtle resonance between two disparate souls, forced into an unlikely proximity, one of whom had just offered a tiny piece of his guarded world. Willow, for her part, felt a strange pull, a reluctant fascination with the complexity of the wolf beside her. The storm's embrace. The rhythmic rumble of the carriage wheels had become a constant, almost soothing backdrop to Willow's internal turmoil. Since their brief, unexpected exchange, the air between them had settled, albeit into a new, more complex stillness. Thorne had returned to his scrolls, his brow furrowed in concentration, but the previous rigid silence had been replaced by a faint hum of something unspoken, a residual warmth from his brief candour. Willow, still perched on her uncomfortable perch, found her gaze drawn to him, a strange, undeniable pull. She observed the way the lamplight highlighted the sharp planes of his face, the intensity in his eyes as he absorbed the contents of a scroll, the powerful set of his shoulders, even when seated. It was a fascination born of fear, yes, but also of something new, something akin to reluctant respect for the sheer weight he carried. Her rumbling stomach, a familiar companion, tightened at the thought of the dried meat and berries he had offered. The memory of the taste, so different from the earthy flavours of the forest, lingered. She wondered if he ever felt hungry, if the burdens of his kingdom ever allowed for such simple, animalistic needs. The thought brought a small, private smile to her lips, a fleeting moment of levity in her gilded cage. Suddenly, a distant clap of thunder, sharp and resonant, ripped through the quiet. Willow flinched, her ears twitching. Another, closer, sent a tremor through the carriage itself. The soft patter of rain against the roof quickly escalated into a drumming deluge, a furious assault that shook the very foundations of their enclosed world. The carriage swayed violently, no longer a smooth, predictable motion, but a lurching, jarring struggle against an unseen force. Willow's breath hitched in her throat. The familiar comfort of the forest, even in a storm, was miles away, replaced by the terrifying confinement of the carriage. The world outside became a blur of frantic grey and green as lightning flashed, illuminating the churning chaos of wind-whipped trees. A particularly fierce gust slammed into the side of the carriage, sending a shudder through the frame and nearly dislodging Willow from her precarious seat. A small, involuntary yelp escaped her, a raw sound of pure fear, and she instinctively clutched her arms around herself, burrowing deeper into the corner as if to make herself disappear. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat matching the storm's fury. Thorn, who had been momentarily paused, a scroll half-rolled in his hand, looked up. His eyes, usually so guarded, held a flicker of something unreadable as he observed her trembling form. Another violent lurch of the carriage, accompanied by a deafening crash of thunder, made Willow press herself even tighter into the corner, her eyes wide with terror. "It's only a storm." Thorn's voice cut through the clamour, gruff and low, yet somehow audible above the tempest. It wasn't a question, nor a command, but a simple statement of fact, delivered with a surprising lack of accusation. He didn't look away, his gaze steady on her. The words, simple as they were a lifeline in the churning fear that threatened to overwhelm her. They weren't soft, not comforting in the way a familiar voice from her pack would have been. But they were there. They acknowledged her fear, without judgment. Willow risked a glance at him, her chest still heaving. He hadn't moved from his seat, hadn't flinched at the roiling chaos outside. He simply sat, observing her, an unreadable depth in his dark eyes. The small, rough assurance was a stark contrast to his usual stoicism, a tiny crack in the formidable wall he presented to the world. It was a singular moment, a thread of unexpected connection woven into the fabric of the storm's fury. The carriage continued to buck and groan, the wind howling like a hungry beast, but within its confines, a fragile shift had occurred. Willow, still trembling, felt a strange, almost imperceptible warmth bloom in her chest, a tiny spark of resilience in the face of her overwhelming fear. She was still terrified, still a forest creature trapped, but she was no longer completely alone in the storm's embrace. And for the first time, the idea of being truly alone in the world outside the carriage, away from this strange, complex king, felt a little less appealing. Thorn, seeing the slight easing of her rigid posture, returned his attention to the scroll, though his movements were a fraction slower, a subtle acknowledgement of the shared moment. The storm raged on, but the atmosphere within the carriage, once purely one of tension and fear, had subtly, irrevocably, changed. Cracks in the armour, the dawn of the second day, brought a fragile quiet to the carriage. The wind, though still biting, had lost its frantic edge, and the rumble of the wheels against the earth felt less like a threat and more like a steady rhythm. Thorn, after a night spent in restless stillness, returned to his scrolls, his brow furrowed deeper than ever. Willow, still curled on the plush seat, felt the lingering ache of fear in her muscles, but a new, unexpected current flowed beneath it. His gruff, unwavering presence during the storm had been a surprising anchor. He cleared his throat, a sound that in this confined space felt surprisingly loud. "The reports are troubling." He didn't look at her, his eyes scanning the parchment before him. Border skirmishes in the north, a blight on the harvest in the west, and the trade routes, plagued by rogue packs. He sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to carry the weight of his entire kingdom. Every solution breeds 3 new problems. Every decision, a cascade of unforeseen consequences. Willow listened, her gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the carriage's velvet lining. She had always imagined the king's life to be one of unassailable power, of effortless command. But his voice, devoid of its usual clipped authority, carried a weariness that resonated deep within her. It was the same weariness she'd seen in the eyes of the elders in her pack when the hunting was lean, or the winter nights stretched long. He continued, almost to himself. The pack leaders demand swift action, the merchants stability, the farmers reign, and all of them, a king who can provide it all, instantly, flawlessly. He finally lifted his head, his silver eyes, usually so sharp and impenetrable, held a flicker of something akin to frustration, even vulnerability. He wasn't looking at her, not directly, but rather through her, at some unseen burden. It is a constant balancing act, one that feels perpetually on the brink of collapse. Willow, for a moment, simply absorbed his words. Her own life had been one of quiet observation, of small, everyday struggles. The grand scale of his problems was almost incomprehensible, yet a simple truth, one she'd learned from watching the ebb and flow of their own small, struggling community, surfaced in her mind. It was a thought so elemental, so unadorned, she almost dismissed it. But seeing the lines of strain etched around his eyes, she found a sliver of courage she hadn't known she possessed. She cleared her own throat, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. Thorne's head snapped towards her, his gaze finally meeting hers, sharp and questioning. For a terrifying second, she thought she'd overstepped, that she had broken some unspoken rule. "Perhaps," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "perhaps the balance isn't meant to be perfectly still." Thorne's expression remained unreadable, but a stillness settled over him, a cessation of the restless energy that had radiated from him. He waited, his attention now fully on her. Encouraged by his silence, she continued, a little stronger now. "The river, it flows, it carves new paths. Sometimes it overflows its banks, sometimes it shrinks to a trickle, but it is always moving. If it were still, it would become stagnant, lifeless." She looked down at her hands, twisting them nervously in her lap. Perhaps a kingdom is like that. Not meant to be frozen in perfect balance, but to adapt, to flow with the changes, to find strength in the movement, not just in the stillness. The silence that followed was profound. Willow braced herself for a dismissive scoff, a cutting remark about her naivete. Instead, Thorne's gaze intensified. He wasn't looking at a fearful, trembling wolf anymore. He was looking at her, truly looking, as if seeing her for the very first time. His eyes, though still sharp, held a new depth, a considering glint. He didn't speak immediately, his mind clearly turning over her words. The shift in his demeanor was palpable. The rigid alpha, burdened by his crown, seemed to soften around the edges, just a fraction. He leaned back against the carriage wall, his fingers tapping a slow, deliberate rhythm against the armrest. "Flow," he repeated, the word sounding foreign, almost alien on his tongue. He looked out the window, his gaze distant, processing, stagnant, lifeless. He turned back to her, and for the first time since she had been trapped in this carriage, his silver eyes held not just observation, but a flicker of genuine curiosity, a silent acknowledgement that she had offered something unexpected, something of value. The cracks in his armour, subtle as they were beginning to show. Echoes of the past. The rhythmic sway of the carriage, no longer a source of terror, had become a subtle lullaby. Willow, curled on her blanket, watched Thorn. He was no longer the imposing figure who'd cornered her, but a wolf burdened by an invisible weight. His gaze, fixed on the passing scenery, held a weariness that resonated with a quiet ache she understood. "Your analogy. It was insightful," Thorn said, breaking the silence, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I've spent so long trying to enforce order. I perhaps forgot that true balance isn't static, but a constant dance." Willow's ears twitched. A compliment from the Alpha King was a foreign concept. "It's how I've always seen things," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Life in the fringes. You learn to observe, to see patterns others miss when they're caught in the thick of it." He turned, his eyes searching hers. "Life in the fringes?" She nodded, a faint blush creeping up her neck. "I've always been forgettable. Not in a bad way, exactly, just unremarkable. The kind of wolf who blends into the forest, who no one looks at twice. My scent never lingered, my voice rarely carried. It made me a good observer, I suppose. I could watch the world unfold without influencing it, just absorbing." She shifted, suddenly feeling exposed. My den was small, tucked away from the main trails. I hunted alone, gathered alone. My days were quiet, punctuated by the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of other packs. A self-deprecating chuckle escaped her. Even the mating gathering was something I'd mostly just watched, from a distance, until now. Thorn listened, his expression unreadable. When she finished, a long silence stretched between them, filled only by the carriage wheels humming over the road. "Forgettable," he finally echoed, a strange note in his voice. I wish I knew what that felt like. He leaned back against the plush seat, a sigh escaping him. My life has been the opposite. Every step scrutinized, every decision weighed against the welfare of thousands. From the moment I could walk, I was tutored, groomed. There was no blending in, no quiet corner to observe from. The crown was a heavy weight even before it rested on my head. Now, it's a constant pressure, a steel band around my skull. He gestured vaguely towards the window. Every crisis in the kingdom, every hungry pup, every dispute between pack leaders, it all funnels back to me. The decisions I make ripple through every den, every hunting ground. Sometimes I feel less like a ruler and more like a dam, holding back an endless torrent of expectations and needs. His gaze met hers, raw and vulnerable. There are days I feel I'm drowning in it. Willow felt a pang of unexpected empathy. She had always imagined the Alpha King as unshakable, a force of nature. To see him so human was disarming. "It sounds lonely," she offered. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Loneliness is a privilege I rarely afford myself. There are too many duties to attend to." His eyes drifted to the window again, a far-off look in them. Though there was one time, a long time ago, before the full weight of it settled in. A festival, held in the spring. I must have been 4, maybe 5 seasons old. My father insisted I attend, despite my protests. He said it was important for the future Alpha to be seen, to connect with the pack. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It was loud, chaotic. So many scents, so many voices. I remember being overwhelmed, trying to hide behind my father's legs. Willow felt a flicker of memory. a faint echo from her own past. "The Spring Bloom Festival," she murmured, almost to herself, "with the fire dancers and the berry tarts." Thorn's head snapped towards her, his eyes widening slightly. "Yes, the berry tarts. They were my favourite." He scrutinised her face, a dawning recognition in his gaze. "And the pup races where everyone cheated." A genuine laugh, light and clear, bubbled from Willow. "I remember. My mother had to drag me away from the tarts. I tried to sneak one more, but I tripped over another pup, and they went flying." Thorn stared at her, his jaw slackening slightly. You were the one. The little grey pup with the smudge of berry on her nose. You cried so hard." Willow's ears flattened in embarrassment, but a warmth spread through her chest. "I was mortified. And then my mother made me apologise, and your father, he gave me another tart, just for me." A slow, incredulous smile spread across Thorn's face, transforming his features. The lines of worry softened, and for a moment he looked like the 4-season-old pup he'd just described. "You're the berry pup," he said, his voice laced with wonder. "I haven't thought of that day in years." Willow, equally astonished, felt a strange connection bloom between them, a fragile thread woven from a shared, long-forgotten childhood memory. The Alpha King, the feared ruler, had once been the scowling pup whose tart she'd ruined, and she, the forgettable wolf, had once been the cause of his small, childhood distress. The distance between them, once vast and insurmountable, suddenly felt a little less so. "And you were the one who wouldn't share his fire-roasted nuts," she countered, a playful glint in her eyes. He chuckled, a rich, genuine sound that filled the carriage. They were perfectly roasted, a rare delicacy. The tension in the carriage, which had been a constant companion, finally receded, replaced by an easy camaraderie born of a shared past. The Alpha King and the quiet wolf, bound by a scattering of berry tarts and a childhood festival. Truths revealed. The quiet warmth of their recently forged connection lingered, dissolving the last remnants of formality between them. Thorn, once the formidable Alpha King, now simply Thorn, sat opposite Willow. A new fatigue shadowed his eyes, distinct from the strain of their travels. He reclined against the plush velvet, his gaze distant, fixed on some unseen point beyond the carriage window. It's not always simple bearing the Alpha title," he began, his voice surprisingly muted, stripped of its usual commanding timbre. He idly picked at a loose thread on his tunic, a small, almost restless gesture Willow wouldn't have imagined him making. "Everyone perceives the crown, the authority. They don't glimpse the confinement." Willow's ears twitched, her full attention now on him. She shifted slightly on her blanket, an unspoken invitation for him to continue. "Every choice, each solitary one, impacts countless lives," Thorn continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The sheer weight of it, it's debilitating. You cannot display frailty, you cannot waver, not for an instant. They demand an anchor, an unyielding force, yet sometimes even anchors, they succumb to erosion." He finally met her gaze, and in his eyes, Willow discerned a profound, aching desolation, a solitude as vast and desolate as the winter plains. "I haven't had a true confidant since before I became Alpha. No one truly sees me, only the title, only the king." A sudden, sharp pang of empathy pierced Willow. She, who had always felt invisible, was now witnessing the crushing burden of being relentlessly scrutinized. The irony wasn't lost on her. "I understand," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Perhaps not the burden of a crown, but the weight of isolation, of feeling like a ghost." Thorn's brow furrowed, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He hadn't expected her to grasp it, not truly. "My entire existence," Willow continued, her gaze dropping to her paws, I've been the wolf relegated to the periphery. The one people forget moments after an encounter. The one who dissolves into the pack without a ripple. My parents, my siblings, they cherish me, I know, but I was always just there. Not the fiercest, not the most striking, not the keenest intellect, just Willow. A designation, but not a presence. She lifted her head, her eyes meeting his directly, a raw vulnerability laid bare. All I've ever truly longed for was to feel as though I mattered. To be noticed, not for some mishap, but for me. To have someone truly perceive me, and wish for me to remain, precisely as I am. The silence in the carriage deepened, charged with the potent current of shared confessions. The rhythmic clatter of hooves against the road was the sole sound, a steady pulse beneath their raw exchange. Thorn simply watched her, his earlier weariness replaced by an intense, focused scrutiny. He wasn't merely looking at her, he was truly seeing her, perhaps for the first time in her life. The layers of the forgettable wolf were shedding, revealing a spirit yearning for recognition, for belonging. He shifted, leaning forward slightly, his posture no longer that of the alpha king, but of one wolf listening intently to another. To be seen, he echoed, the words a low rumble in his chest. Yes, I know that yearning, Willow, though mine is for a different sort of vision. To be seen for the struggle, not just the strength, for the doubt, not just the conviction. A profound understanding flowed between them, a silent bridge forged in the space between their revelations. It wasn't pity, not on either side, but a deep, resonant empathy. Two isolated souls, one by choice and circumstance, the other by an accidental obscurity, finding common ground in the most improbable of settings. The vast, seemingly impassable chasm that had separated the Alpha King and the stowaway wolf had narrowed to a navigable path, illuminated by the unexpected glow of shared truth. The journey, initially a terror, was now transforming into something entirely new, a revelation. The carriage, once a prison, was becoming a sanctuary. Journey's end. New beginning. A subtle shift in the carriage's rhythm, a gentle decrease in the rhythmic jostling, pulled Willow from the lingering echoes of their shared confessions. The soft murmur of the wheels over the packed earth became less a continuous hum and more a series of distinct rotations. Outside, the world was no longer a blur of passing trees, but a tapestry of individual trunks and branches, each detail coming into sharper focus. Then came the voices. Muffled at first, like distant whispers carried on the wind, they grew steadily clearer. The low thud of heavy boots on the ground, the clink of metal against leather, the soft snorts of horses. The sounds were no longer just background noise. They were the unmistakable signals of arrival, the preamble to their separation. Willow's heart, which had just begun to unfurl its tightly wound petals in Thorn's presence, now contracted with a familiar, unwelcome pang. The intimacy of the past few days, the unexpected vulnerability they had shared, was about to shatter. She would soon be just another face in the crowd at the mating gathering, a forgotten wolf blending into the anonymity she had always known. The thought, once a comfort, now felt like a profound loss. Thorn, too, seemed to sense the change. His gaze, which had been fixed on some internal landscape, slowly returned to the present. He looked at Willow, and in his eyes she saw not the stern, regal Alpha King she had first encountered, but a new softness, a vulnerability that mirrored her own. It was a look that acknowledged the fragile bridge they had built between them, a silent admission of the unexpected connection that now bound them. "We're almost there," he said, his voice a low rumble that resonated in the quiet space. It wasn't a question, but a statement of undeniable fact. a pronouncement of their imminent return to their separate worlds. Before Willow could respond, a firm rap echoed on the carriage door. "Your Majesty!" a young voice called out. "Rorik, with dinner. Elder Maeve sends her regards and says we are approximately an hour's ride from the mating grounds." Thorn nodded, a subtle gesture that Willow felt more than saw. "Enter, Rorik." The door opened, revealing a young guard, his uniform crisp, his eyes wide with a mixture of eagerness and deference. He carried a heavy tray laden with steaming dishes, the rich aroma of roasted meat and herbs filling the carriage. He avoided looking directly at Willow, his gaze darting around the small space before settling on Thorn. "Thank you, Rorik," Thorn said, his voice regaining a touch of its customary authority. "Place it on the table." Rorik carefully set the tray down on the small, collapsible table that had been folded away since breakfast. His movements were precise, almost overly so, betraying his nervousness in the Alpha King's presence. He risked a quick glance at Willow, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes, before quickly averting them. He knew, everyone knew, that no one was supposed to be in Thorn's private carriage. The rumours, no doubt, would already be swirling. "Is there anything else, Your Majesty?" Rorik asked, his voice a little too loud in the sudden silence. "No, Rorik. You may return to your post," Thorn replied, a subtle dismissal in his tone. As the door closed, sealing them once more in their temporary sanctuary, the air crackled with unspoken thoughts. The arrival of Rorik, Elder Maeve's message, the scent of a fresh meal, they were all stark reminders of the world waiting outside, a world that would demand their return to their predetermined roles. Willow looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the worn fabric of her simple dress. The thought of stepping out of this carriage, out of Thorn's immediate presence, filled her with a profound sense of apprehension. She had spent her entire life trying not to be noticed, and now, after being truly seen by the Alpha King, the prospect of fading back into the shadows felt unbearable. Thorn reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before gently covering hers. His touch was warm, comforting, a silent acknowledgement of her unspoken fear. "It won't be the same," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Nothing will be the same." Willow looked up, her eyes meeting his. In their depths, she saw not just understanding, but a quiet promise. A promise that the connection they had forged, the understanding they had found, would not be extinguished by the demands of their separate lives. It was a promise that offered a glimmer of hope in the face of impending separation, a fragile beacon in the coming storm. The journey was ending, but a new one, far more complex and uncertain, was just beginning. The path ahead was unknown, but for the first time in her life, Willow didn't feel entirely alone facing it. An unexpected offer. The carriage lurched, a final settling thud announcing their arrival. Outside, the air, sharp with pine and damp earth, pressed in. A stark departure from the familiar, worn leather of their temporary haven. Willow's heart, a fluttery bird during their journey, now beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was it, the close of their unlikely interlude, the moment she would dissolve back into anonymity, and Thorn would reclaim his throne, his duties, his impenetrable resolve. She shifted, her gaze drawn to him. Thorn, usually an unyielding pillar of authority, now seemed subtly burdened. The intense golden light she'd grown accustomed to in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a flicker she couldn't quite name: regret, resignation. As if sensing her scrutiny, he turned, a faint, almost imperceptible curve softening his lips. The gesture, so tender, so unlike the Alpha King, stole her breath. "Willow," he rumbled, his voice stripped of its usual command, imbued instead with an uncharacteristic gentleness that sent a shiver through her. "We are here." She swallowed, her throat dry and constricted. I know, she managed a mere whisper. The thought of stepping out, of facing the bustling mating grounds alone, suddenly loomed. The anonymity she'd once craved now felt like a vast, desolate expanse. Thorn reached out, his hand hovering before settling lightly on her arm, a comforting anchor amidst her swirling emotions. I've been doing a great deal of thinking, he continued, his gaze fixed on a distant point beyond the window. About our journey. About everything. Willow's pulse hammered. Was this a formal dismissal? A polite goodbye? Her dread of being forgotten, of their connection fading to a forgotten dream, intensified. He cleared his throat, a small, human sound that further chipped away at his formidable persona. You possess a clarity of sight, Willow, a quiet wisdom I've found invaluable. He turned to face her fully, his intense golden eyes now holding a raw vulnerability that startled her. My court teems with wolves who speak loudly, who jostle for attention, who offer counsel rooted in ambition rather than truth. You are not like them. She stared, bewildered. His sincere words were a balm to her battered spirit, yet deepened her confusion. What was he saying? The burdens of leadership are heavy, Thorn continued, his voice softening further, almost conversational. And I've borne them largely alone. I need voices of reason, voices unafraid to challenge my assumptions, to see beyond immediate political games. He paused, his thumb gently stroking her arm. I need you, Willow. Her eyes widened. The mating grounds buzzed with distant sounds of arrivals, but inside the carriage, time seemed to halt. I am offering you a place in my court, he stated, his voice regaining a touch of regal authority, yet still laced with profound gentleness. Not as a mate, for that decision cannot be made lightly, nor under these unusual circumstances. He met her gaze directly, but as an advisor, as a voice I trust, someone who sees things as they are, unclouded by agenda. Willow's jaw dropped, the words hung in the air, shimmering with impossible weight. An advisor? Her? The quiet, unremarkable wolf who had stumbled into his life by accident. The depth of his trust, the sheer unexpectedness of the offer, stole her breath. She had anticipated being cast aside, dismissed with a polite nod, and a return to her former anonymity. Instead, he was offering her a role, a purpose, a place at his side that transcended superficial societal demands. It was an acknowledgement of their connection, a testament to the fact that he saw her, truly saw her, beyond expectations. A wave of potent emotion washed through her, threatening to overwhelm. There was dizzying, immense relief that their shared journey wouldn't simply end here. There was gratitude, a burning warmth in her chest, for his unwavering belief, and beneath it all, a fragile, burgeoning hope that this was not an ending, but a new, unforeseen beginning. Thorn, she began, her voice thick with unshed tears, utterly stunned. He merely smiled, a genuine, open expression transforming his stern features. Think about it, he said, the gentle pressure on her arm tightening almost imperceptibly. But know this, Willow. My offer is genuine, and I truly believe my pack, and I, would be better for your presence. The carriage door opened, letting in a gush of cool air and the excited chatter of the gathering wolves. Their private world had officially dissolved. Yet, as Willow looked at Thorn, a silent promise passed between them, a shared understanding that their journey, in ways neither could have predicted, was far from over. A place to belong, the carriage's rhythm, once a constant thrum, now faded beneath the vibrant thump of her heart. Thorn's words resonated, a warm current through the unexpected hush. I offer you a place by my side, not as a mate, but as an advisor, a voice of clarity. Willow's thoughts reeled. Her life had been a hushed whisper in the sprawling forest, a shadow among the pack's vivid tapestry. Anonymity had been her sanctuary, a return to forgotten corners where she felt safest. Yet Thorn, the formidable Alpha King, extended an invitation to belonging. He truly saw her, not as a stowaway nor a nuisance, but as someone essential whose perspective held immense value. A faint smile bloomed on her lips, an unfamiliar sensation spreading warmth through her chest. It wasn't infatuation, but profound relief, gratitude, and a nascent hope she'd never dared to cultivate. This accidental journey, spurred by a mistaken scent and a desperate need for solitude, had unveiled a connection she'd unknowingly craved. The quiet girl, long overlooked, was now offered a seat at the table of power. The notion was dizzying, yet strangely grounding. Thorn observed her, a subtle weariness still etched around his eyes, softened now by a flicker of tenderness. He had revealed a vulnerability, a testament to his trust. His offer wasn't impulsive. It was a measured decision, forged from their shared ordeal, from the quiet honesty that had blossomed within the confines of his private carriage. He wasn't just offering a position. He was proposing a partnership, an alliance of minds. A soft knock interrupted the moment. Rorik, a young guard, entered, his gaze darting nervously between Willow and Thorn. He bore a tray laden with roasted game and fresh bread. The scents of rosemary and warm yeast filled the carriage. "Your Majesty," he stammered, quickly averting his gaze. "Dinner, and a message from Elder Maeve. We are 2 hours from the mating grounds." Rorik swiftly placed the tray on the small table before Thorn, bowing deeply, his discomfort palpable. He was clearly aware of Willow's presence in the Alpha King's private space, his hasty exit a testament to his eagerness to escape the awkwardness. Thorn merely nodded, dismissing the guard with a wave. He then turned back to Willow, a question in his steady gaze. "Willow." Her name, spoken by him, resonated with fresh significance. It wasn't merely a label, it was an acknowledgement, an invitation. She drew a deep breath, the aroma of the evening meal, a grounding presence amidst the whirlwind of her emotions. "Yes," she whispered, her voice gaining strength with each syllable. "Yes, Thorn, I accept." A rare and beautiful smile graced Thorn's face then, easing the habitual lines of worry from his brow. It was a smile of quiet triumph, of a burden lightened. He had discovered something he hadn't known he was seeking, a missing piece of the puzzle. They ate in comfortable silence, the shared meal a tacit affirmation of their new understanding. The journey, which had felt interminable, now seemed to race toward its conclusion. Each jolt of the carriage, each shift in the passing landscape, brought them closer to a future neither could have predicted. As dusk's last light bled into the horizon, Thorn stretched, a languid movement reflecting deep-seated weariness. "It's time," he rumbled. He reached for the door handle, and the sudden rush of cool night air was a sharp contrast to the carriage's warm intimacy. Willow followed him, her heart thrumming with a mixture of apprehension and excitement. The mating grounds unfurled before them, a vast clearing bathed in the soft glow of 1,000 lanterns. The air pulsed with the murmur of hundreds of wolves, their collective energy a tangible force. This was where destinies were woven, where new bonds were forged, and for Willow, it was where her old life ended, and a new one, tethered to the formidable Alpha King, began. Thorn stepped out first, his powerful frame silhouetted against the lantern light. He turned, offering his hand to Willow, a gesture of quiet support, of open acknowledgement. She placed her smaller hand in his, and the touch was firm, reassuring. As she stepped out of the carriage, the soft grass beneath her paws, the cool night air on her face, she felt a profound shift. She was no longer just Willow, the forgettable wolf. She was Willow, the Alpha King's advisor, stepping into a future she hadn't dared to dream of, a place where she finally belonged. The murmurs of the gathered wolves seemed to subside slightly, their eyes drawn to the unexpected sight of their Alpha King emerging from his private carriage, not alone, but with a quiet, unassuming wolf by his side. The future, for both of them, was about to begin.